My name is Clementine, I'm 24 now, and 6 years ago my parents destroyed everything I believed about family loyalty with 4 simple words: "You're such a burden." I was 18 holding my acceptance letter to Northwestern University, tears streaming down my face as I begged them for help with tuition. What happened next didn't just change my life, it exposed a family secret so devastating that it would eventually bring down their perfect facade and serve them the karma they never saw coming. Before we dive into this family revenge story that'll make you question everything about blood loyalty, tell me, where are you watching from? If you're ready for a tale of betrayal, justice, and the sweetest revenge served ice cold, smash that like button and subscribe, because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you'll want to see how this family drama unfolds and how sometimes the universe has the most poetic way of making things right. Growing up in suburban Chicago, I always knew I was different from my older brother Marcus. While he got brand new cars for his 16th birthday, a shiny red Mustang that made all his friends jealous, I got a used bicycle from Craigslist for mine. When Marcus wanted to join expensive sports camps or take guitar lessons, my parents never hesitated to write those checks. But when I asked for art supplies or wanted to join the debate team, suddenly money was tight. "Clementine, we have to be practical," my mother would say, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, the one Dad bought her for their anniversary. "Marcus has natural athletic talent. It's an investment in his future." The irony wasn't lost on me that they could afford to invest thousands in Marcus's potential, while my straight-A report cards went largely unnoticed on the refrigerator, usually covered by Marcus's mediocre test scores, that somehow earned more praise. My father, a successful insurance broker, and my mother, who worked part-time at an upscale boutique, more for social status than necessity, had always made it clear that Marcus was their pride and joy. He was 6 feet tall, conventionally handsome, and charming in that effortless way that made adults trust him instantly. I was the quiet, bookish daughter who preferred reading to parties who spent weekends writing stories instead of shopping at the mall. The favoritism wasn't just about money, it was systemic, woven into every family interaction. During dinner conversations, Marcus's day was always discussed first and at length. His latest conquest in basketball, his plans with friends, his thoughts on college. When it was my turn, if there was time left, my parents would offer distracted nods while scrolling through their phones. "That's nice, honey," became my mother's default response to any achievement I shared. I remember one particularly painful Thanksgiving when I was 17. I had just won first place in the state writing competition, a huge accomplishment that came with a $2,000 scholarship. I was bursting to share the news with our extended family. But before I could speak, Marcus announced he had made varsity basketball, and the entire dinner conversation revolved around his athletic prowess. When I finally mentioned my writing award, my aunt politely congratulated me, but within minutes the conversation had shifted back to Marcus's basketball schedule. That night, I heard my parents talking in their bedroom. "At least Marcus is well-rounded," my mother said. "Clementine is so intense with all that writing stuff." "It's not very social, is it?" my father agreed, adding that they worried about my future prospects because I was too in my head and needed to be more like Marcus if I wanted to succeed in the real world. The message was clear: Marcus was the investment worthy of their time, money, and emotional energy. I was the consolation prize they were stuck with, someone to be managed rather than celebrated. But I held on to hope that when it really mattered, when it came to my future and my education, they would step up and show me that I mattered too. I worked tirelessly throughout high school, maintaining a 4 gigapascals while working weekends at a local bookstore to save money for college. I researched scholarships obsessively, wrote essay after essay, and applied to dozens of programs. My guidance counselor called me one of the most dedicated students she'd ever worked with. I was determined to prove that their quiet, bookish daughter could achieve something remarkable. When the acceptance letter from Northwestern arrived, my dream school with their prestigious journalism program, I felt like I was holding my golden ticket. Northwestern wasn't just any university. It was a gateway to the career I dreamed of since I was 12 years old. The journalism program had produced Pulitzer Prize winners, and their alumni worked at every major news outlet in the country. This was my chance to show my parents that all those hours spent writing all that intensity they criticized had been leading somewhere incredible. I had received a partial academic scholarship that covered about 60% of the tuition, but I still needed help with the remaining $30,000 per year. For a family that had never hesitated to spend that amount on Marcus's various pursuits, I thought this ask would be a no-brainer. I had done everything right, exceeded every expectation, and earned my way into one of the most competitive journalism programs in the country. The day I decided to tell my parents about Northwestern, I planned everything carefully. I chose a Friday evening when everyone would be relaxed after a nice dinner that I had actually cooked myself their favorite lasagna recipe. I had printed out all the information about the scholarship I'd earned, the prestige of the program, and even researched the starting salaries of Northwestern journalism graduates to show them this was a sound investment. Marcus was there too, lounging on the couch in his leather jacket, scrolling through his phone. He had already been accepted to several universities on athletic scholarships, so his future was secure without any financial strain on our parents. I felt like this was finally my moment to shine, to show them that their investment in me would pay off just as much as their investment in Marcus had. Mom, Dad, I began my heart racing with excitement and nervousness. I have some incredible news to share with you. I pulled out the acceptance letter, my hands trembling slightly. I got into Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship. I watched their faces expecting to see pride, excitement, maybe even surprise at how well I had done. Instead, I saw my mother's expression tighten, and my father set down his coffee cup with a heavy sigh. Marcus looked up from his phone with mild interest as if I had just announced the weather. "That's nice, Clementine," my mother said slowly. "But Northwestern is very expensive, isn't it?" "Well, yes, but I earned a scholarship that covers most of it," I said quickly, launching into my prepared presentation. "I only need help with about $30,000 a year, and the starting salary for graduates is $30,000 a year." My father interrupted his voice, already taking on that tone that meant the conversation was over before it began. "Clementine, that's a lot of money. We have Marcus's college to think about too." "But Marcus has full athletic scholarships," I protested, confused. "He doesn't need any money for college." My parents exchanged a look that I couldn't decipher. "There are other expenses," my mother said vaguely. "And we need to be practical about career choices. Journalism isn't exactly the most stable field." I felt my carefully constructed presentation crumbling. "But I've wanted to be a journalist since I was 12. You know how hard I've worked for this. This is Northwestern. It's one of the best programs in the country." "Clementine," my father said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that made me feel like a child. "You need to be realistic. Maybe you should consider community college for the first 2 years, then transfer somewhere more affordable. Or pick a more practical major." The words hit me like a physical blow. Community college? After everything I had achieved, after all the hours of studying, working, writing scholarship essays until my fingers cramped, they were suggesting community college. I looked at Marcus, who was back to scrolling through his phone as if my dreams being crushed was just background noise. "You spent more than that on Marcus's car," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And his sports camps. And his—" "That's different," my mother snapped. Those were investments in practical skills. Marcus's athletics opened doors. So, does a Northwestern degree. I shot back, feeling tears beginning to sting my eyes. This is my dream. This is everything I've worked for. My father stood up, clearly annoyed that this conversation was taking so long. Clementine, you need to understand that we can't just throw money at every whim. You're being unrealistic about what we can afford. It's not a whim, I was crying, now clutching the acceptance letter to my chest. I've never asked you for anything major. I've worked for everything I have. I just need help with this one thing, the most important thing in my life. That's when my mother said the words that would echo in my mind for years to come. Clementine, you're being such a burden. We've given you everything you need, and it's never enough. You're so selfish. A burden. Their daughter, who had never gotten into trouble, who had worked part-time jobs since she was 16, who had earned a scholarship to one of the best universities in the country, was a burden for asking for help to pursue her dreams. Marcus finally looked up from his phone. Maybe you should just pick a cheaper school, Clem. It's not that big a deal. I stared at my family, these people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and realized that I had been living in a fantasy. I had spent 18 years believing that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, proved myself enough, I would finally earn their love and support. But the truth was staring me in the face. I was never going to be enough for them. I ran to my room and slammed the door, collapsing on my bed with the Northwestern letter still clutched in my hands. Through my sobs, I could hear them downstairs, already moving on with their evening, as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just shattered their daughter's heart and dreams in the span of 5 minutes. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Lying in my bed that night, staring at the Northwestern acceptance letter through blurry tears, something crystallized inside me. The hurt was transforming into something else, determination, mixed with a cold, calculated fury. They called me a burden. They said I was unrealistic. Fine. I would show them exactly what their burden of a daughter was capable of. I spent the entire weekend researching every possible option. Student loans, work-study programs, additional scholarships, even schools that might offer me better financial aid packages. By Sunday night, I had a plan that was so audacious, it scared me, but I was desperate enough to try anything. Monday morning, I walked into my guidance counselor's office with a folder full of research and a proposal that made her eyebrows shoot up to her hairline. Clementine, Mrs. Patterson said slowly, "This is ambitious." "Are you sure you want to take on this much debt?" "I'm sure," I replied firmly. "I'll take out the maximum student loans available, and I'll work 3 jobs if I have to. I'm not giving up on Northwestern." Mrs. Patterson helped me navigate the financial aid process, and we discovered I could cover more costs than I initially thought through a combination of federal loans, work study, and a few smaller scholarships I hadn't known about. It would mean graduating with about $80, 0 inches debt, which was terrifying, but it was doable. But the real breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson mentioned something that stopped me cold. "You know, Clementine, there's one more option you might consider. Northwestern has a work-study program specifically for journalism students. You'd work for the university's media department, helping produce content for their alumni magazine and website. It doesn't pay much, but it includes housing. Housing. The most expensive part of the entire equation suddenly solved. With the scholarship, loans, work study, and living in university housing, I could make it work. It would be tight, and I'd graduate with significant debt, but I could do it without my parents' help." That night at dinner, I made my announcement, with the same calm confidence I'd seen my father use in his business dealings. "I wanted to let you know that I've figured out how to attend Northwestern without any financial help from you." The silence was deafening. Marcus actually put down his phone. My mother's fork was frozen halfway to her mouth. How, my father asked, his tone skeptical. I laid out my plan methodically, the loans, the work study, the housing arrangement. "I'll graduate with debt, but Northwestern graduates have excellent job placement rates. I'll pay it off." "Clementine," my mother said, her voice taking on that fake concern tone, "that's so much debt. Are you sure you want to burden yourself with that?" The irony of her using the word burden wasn't lost on me. "I'd rather burden myself than be a burden to anyone else," I replied evenly. My father frowned. "You're being impulsive. This is a huge financial mistake," maybe I said, standing up from the table. "But it's my mistake to make." But what I didn't know then was that my parents' refusal to help wasn't really about money at all. As I would discover years later, there was a much darker reason they didn't want me to succeed, a secret they'd been keeping since before I was born, one that made their favoritism toward Marcus not just cruel but calculating. The months leading up to graduation were a whirlwind of preparation. I worked extra shifts at the bookstore, saved every penny, and threw myself into final scholarship applications. My parents watched my efforts with what I now recognize as nervous skepticism, as if they were waiting for me to fail and come crawling back to them. The night before I left for Northwestern, my mother knocked on my bedroom door. I was packing the last of my belongings, mostly books, and the few clothes I owned into 2 suitcases and a backpack. "Clementine," she said softly, "you don't have to do this. We could. Maybe we could help with some of the costs if you chose a school closer to home." I looked at her, this woman who had called me a burden just months earlier, now offering help with conditions attached. "Why?" I asked. "Why now?" She couldn't meet my eyes. We worry about you being so far away." Even then, I sensed there was more to it, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "I'll be fine," I told her. "I've gotten this far on my own." The next morning, as I loaded my car with my meager possessions, Marcus actually helped carry one of my suitcases. "Hey, Clem," he said awkwardly, "for what it's worth, I think what you're doing is pretty cool." It was the nicest thing he'd said to me in years, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe my leaving would change our family dynamic for the better. My parents stood on the porch watching me drive away with expressions I couldn't read. My mother was crying, but I didn't know if it was from sadness or relief. As I drove toward my new life in Evanston, Illinois, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I was completely on my own for the first time in my life, with no safety net except my own determination. But I was also free from their low expectations, their comparisons, their casual cruelty disguised as practicality. If you're watching this and thinking about whether I made the right choice, stick around because this story gets so much crazier. Sometimes the universe has a way of revealing truths that change everything you thought you knew about your life. What I discovered about my family 3 years later didn't just vindicate my decision, it exposed a betrayal so deep that it would ultimately destroy their perfect little world and serve them a justice they never saw coming. Northwestern University became my sanctuary and my proving ground all at once. The first year was brutal. I was working 25 hours a week in the media department, taking a full course load and trying to navigate social dynamics with classmates who casually talked about spring break trips to Europe while I calculated whether I could afford ramen for dinner again. But I thrived academically in ways that shocked even me. Professor Martinez, who taught my introductory journalism course, pulled me aside after the first month. "Clementine, your writing has a raw honesty that can't be taught. Have you considered investigative journalism?" Investigative journalism. The word sent a thrill through me that I hadn't felt since opening my Northwestern acceptance letter. This wasn't just reporting, this was uncovering truth, holding powerful people accountable, giving voice to the voiceless. It felt like destiny. I threw myself into investigative work with an obsession that concerned my roommate. "Clem, you need to sleep sometimes," Sarah would say, finding me hunched over my laptop at 3 in the morning following paper trails and cross-referencing public records for my latest story. My first major breakthrough came sophomore year when I uncovered a scandal involving the university's housing department, overcharging low-income students for supposedly premium dorm rooms that were actually in worse condition than standard housing. The story I wrote not only got published in the campus newspaper, but was picked up by the Chicago Tribune. More importantly, it resulted in policy changes and refunds for affected students. Professor Martinez nominated my housing investigation for a National College Journalism Award. When I won third place, it came with a $5,000 prize, more money than I'd ever had at one time. For the first time since leaving home, I called my parents with genuinely good news. "That's wonderful, honey," my mother said, but her voice sounded strained. "Though I hope you're not making enemies with all this investigative work. It's called holding people accountable." "Mom," I replied, confused by her response. "Isn't that what journalists are supposed to do?" My father got on the phone. "Just be careful, Clementine. Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep into things." Their lack of enthusiasm stung, but I was starting to care less about their approval. I had professors who believed in me, classmates who respected my work, and for the first time in my life, I was building an identity separate from being Marcus's sister or the disappointing daughter. Junior year brought an internship at the Chicago Sun-Times that was supposed to be unpaid, but my editor liked my work so much that she found budget to pay me a small stipend. I was covering local politics and municipal corruption, exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing. My byline appeared regularly, and I was building a portfolio that would make me competitive for jobs at major newspapers after graduation. Meanwhile, my family's updates felt increasingly foreign to my new reality. Marcus had graduated from college and was working at a car dealership, not exactly the grand future my parents had invested so heavily in. But when I asked about his post-graduation plans during our brief phone calls, my parents quickly changed the subject. "How's the journalism going?" my mother would ask, but there was always something off about her tone. It was less like pride in my accomplishments and more like monitoring, as if she was keeping tabs on what I was investigating rather than celebrating my success. The warning signs were subtle, but they were there. When I mentioned I was working on a story about insurance fraud in Illinois, my father quickly interrupted to ask about my grades. When I told them about an investigation into local political corruption that involved some prominent Chicago area business owners, my mother suddenly had to get off the phone for a doctor's appointment. I should have paid more attention to these red flags, but I was too focused on my own trajectory to notice that my family seemed increasingly nervous about my career choice. I was busy proving to myself and the world that I could succeed on my own terms. By senior year, I had job offers from 3 different newspapers. The one I accepted was with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, not my dream paper, but a solid regional newspaper with a strong investigative team and a mentor who promised to help me develop my skills further. Graduation day was surreal. My parents came, of course, along with Marcus and his new girlfriend. They seemed proud in the photos, smiling as I posed in my cap and gown, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't quite identify. During the ceremony, when they called my name for graduating summa cum laude, I heard my mother crying, but when I looked over at her, her expression was more complicated than simple pride. At dinner afterward, my father raised his glass. "To Clementine," he said, "who always finds a way to get what she wants." The toast felt backhanded, but I chose to take it as a compliment. I had gotten what I wanted, despite their lack of support. I had graduated debt-free thanks to scholarships I'd earned through my investigative work, and I was starting my career at a respected newspaper. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I didn't need their approval or their money to succeed. But as I would discover just 1 year later, my success in investigative journalism was about to uncover a truth that would explain everything about my childhood, my parents' strange behavior, and why they had been so desperate to keep me from pursuing the very career that would eventually expose their darkest secret. The irony is almost poetic. When I think about it now, they called me a burden for wanting to become an investigative journalist, not knowing that my investigative skills would eventually be the very thing that brought their house of cards crashing down. Working at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel was everything I had hoped for and more. My editor, Janet Rodriguez, was a Pulitzer Prize winner who took me under her wing and taught me the art of patient, methodical investigation. Good investigative journalism is like archaeology, she would say. You brush away one layer of dirt at a time until you uncover what's buried underneath. I had been at the paper for about a year when I was assigned to investigate a series of insurance fraud cases across the Midwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment following up on suspicious claims patterns that had been flagged by state regulators. But as I dug deeper into the public records, cross-referencing claim dates with policy purchases and payout amounts, I started noticing some troubling patterns. One name kept appearing across multiple cases: Hartwell Insurance Solutions, my father's company. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. My father ran a mid-sized insurance brokerage in Chicago, and it wasn't unusual for his company name to appear in public records. But as I pulled more documentation requesting files through Freedom of Information Act requests and analyzing claim patterns, the coincidences became impossible to ignore. There were dozens of suspicious claims connected to my father's company policies taken out on elderly clients who died within months, life insurance claims for people with no known relatives except for distant beneficiaries who turned out to be shell companies, and a pattern of inflated property damage claims that had been approved without proper investigation. My hands were shaking as I printed out the documents. This couldn't be right. My father was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. He served on the board of our local Chamber of Commerce. He couldn't be involved in insurance fraud. But investigative journalism had taught me to follow the evidence, not my emotions. And the evidence was damning. I spent 3 sleepless nights double-checking everything, hoping I had made a mistake. But every new document I uncovered made the case stronger. My father wasn't just involved in the fraud, he appeared to be orchestrating it. His company was the common thread connecting dozens of fraudulent claims across 3 states involving millions of dollars in illegitimate payouts. The worst part was discovering the victims. Many were elderly clients who had trusted my father with their life insurance policies, not knowing he was manipulating their policies for fraudulent claims. Some were low-income families who had paid premiums for years for policies that had been secretly altered to benefit my father's scheme instead of their intended beneficiaries. Then I found the connection that made everything click into place, Marcus. Hidden in the maze of paperwork was evidence that Marcus had been involved in the scheme since his sophomore year of college. He hadn't been working at just any car dealership after graduation. He had been working at dealerships that were part of the fraud network, facilitating inflated insurance claims on stolen or damaged vehicles that were then resold through a complex network of shell companies. Suddenly, everything about my childhood made sense. The lavish spending on Marcus wasn't favoritism, it was money laundering. The expensive cars, the sports camps, the private coaching, it was all a way to funnel fraudulent insurance money through seemingly legitimate expenses. Marcus wasn't the golden child. He was an unwitting accomplice who had been groomed since childhood to help legitimize their criminal enterprise. And my parents' reaction to my Northwestern acceptance wasn't about money or practicality, it was about fear. They couldn't afford to have an investigative journalist in the family, someone who might stumble across their crimes the way I just had. I thought about all those times my father had discouraged my interest in investigative journalism, all those moments when my parents seemed nervous about my career choice. They hadn't been worried about my future, they had been worried about their own. The betrayal was staggering. Not only had they denied me support for my education while funding Marcus's lifestyle with stolen money, but they had actively tried to sabotage my career because it posed a threat to their criminal operation. Every dismissive comment about my intensity, every suggestion that I should choose a more practical major, every time they called me a burden, it had all been manipulation designed to protect their secrets. I sat in my small Milwaukee apartment, surrounded by evidence of my family's crimes, and felt a cold fury settle into my bones. They had stolen from vulnerable people for years. They had denied me support while living off the proceeds of their theft. And they had tried to destroy my dreams to protect their criminal enterprise. But now their worst nightmare had come true. Their burden of a daughter had become exactly the kind of investigative journalist who could expose everything. I called Janet the next morning. I need to recuse myself from the insurance fraud story, I told her, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Why? She asked, immediately alert to the tension in my voice. Because my family is involved, and I think we're going to need to call the FBI. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, meetings with federal investigators, and the surreal experience of handing over evidence that would destroy my own family. But I never hesitated. The victims of their fraud deserved justice, and I wasn't going to let family loyalty protect criminals, especially criminals who had never shown me any loyalty in return. As I sat in the FBI field office watching agents review the evidence I had uncovered, I thought about that 18-year-old girl who had been called a burden for asking for help with college tuition. That girl could never have imagined that 6 years later, she would be the one to bring down the very people who had rejected her. The universe has a funny way of serving justice, and sometimes it uses the people you underestimate most to deliver the consequences you least expect. The FBI raid happened on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years after I had graduated from Northwestern. I wasn't there to see it, but Janet made sure I got all the details from her law enforcement contacts. Federal agents simultaneously hit my father's office, my parents' house, and the car dealership where Marcus worked. They seized computers, financial records, and boxes of documents that would ultimately expose the full scope of the fraud scheme. My parents were arrested at their home, the same home where they had called me a burden for asking for college help. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were handcuffed in the kitchen, where they had dismissed my dreams while sitting on millions of dollars in stolen money. Marcus was arrested at work, still wearing the polo shirt with the dealership logo, still playing the role of the golden child, who didn't know his entire life had been built on criminal proceeds. According to the FBI agent I spoke with, he seemed genuinely shocked, which suggested my parents had kept him largely in the dark about the extent of the operation. The local news coverage was immediate and brutal. Prominent insurance broker arrested in multi-state fraud scheme ran on every Chicago station. The photos they used were from community events, my father shaking hands with the mayor, my mother at charity fundraisers, both of them looking like pillars of respectability. But the detail that made me smile with grim satisfaction was buried in the third paragraph of the Tribune's coverage. The investigation was initiated by insurance fraud analyst reports and was significantly advanced by information provided by an investigative journalist working for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. They didn't name me in the article. The FBI had kept my identity confidential at my request, but I knew my parents would figure it out. Their burden of a daughter had become their worst nightmare. The trial took 18 months, and I followed every detail from my new position at the Washington Post, where Janet had recommended me for an investigative role. The promotion felt like vindication. I was now working for one of the most prestigious newspapers in the country, exactly the kind of career my parents had tried to discourage. The evidence I had uncovered formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The fraud scheme had been operating for over a decade, stealing approximately $12 million from insurance companies and policyholders. My father was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. My mother, who had been handling the money laundering through her boutique job, got 8 years. Marcus, who cooperated with prosecutors and testified against my parents, received 2 years probation and community service. The victims' impact statements at sentencing were heartbreaking. Elderly clients talked about losing their life insurance benefits. Families described discovering that policies they had paid into for years were worthless because of my father's manipulations. One woman whose late husband's life insurance had been fraudulently redirected looked directly at my father during her statement and said, You stole my children's future to pay for your own children's luxuries. During the sentencing hearing, my father's lawyer made a final plea for leniency, mentioning that my father was a family man who had made mistakes while trying to provide for his children. The prosecutor's response was swift and devastating. Your Honor, Mr. Hartwell's own daughter, an investigative journalist, was the one who uncovered this scheme and reported it to federal authorities. Even his family recognized that his crimes were unforgivable. I wasn't in the courtroom that day, but a source told me that my father's face went completely white when the prosecutor mentioned my role. The man who had called me a burden had finally learned what burden really meant, the burden of facing consequences for his actions, delivered by the daughter he had underestimated. The financial devastation was complete. Their house, the house where I had grown up, feeling like a second-class citizen, was seized and sold to pay restitution to victims. My mother's jewelry, including that diamond tennis bracelet she used to adjust while telling me money was tight, was auctioned off. The cars, the furniture, the expensive artwork they had accumulated, all of it went to compensating the people they had stolen from. Marcus lost everything too. The car dealership fired him immediately, and his criminal record made it nearly impossible to find work in sales. The last I heard, he was working construction and living in a studio apartment, a far cry from the privileged life my parents had built for him with stolen money. But perhaps the most satisfying detail came 2 years after the sentencing, when I received a letter forwarded through my old address. It was from my mother, written from federal prison. "Clementine," it began, "I know you probably hate us, and I understand why. But I need you to know that we never meant for things to get so out of hand. Your father started with small claims, just trying to provide for the family, and it grew beyond our control. We were wrong to refuse to help you with college, especially when we had the money. We were wrong to call you a burden. You were never a burden, you were the most honest one in the family, and that scared us. I know you'll probably never forgive us, but I'm proud of who you've become, even if it meant exposing us. You did the right thing." I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Forgiveness might come someday, but accountability had to come first. And thanks to my investigative work, accountability had been served with interest. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever had a moment when someone underestimated you so completely that it actually led to their own downfall? Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us the motivation we need to become exactly who we're meant to be. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear about your own experiences with family karma and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Drop a comment below and share your story, whether it's about overcoming family dysfunction, pursuing your dreams despite opposition, or finding the courage to do the right thing when it costs you everything. And if you enjoyed this journey from family burden to family justice, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about how sometimes the universe has the most poetic way of making things right. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that being underestimated by your family doesn't define your worth. Sometimes it just reveals theirs. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, the people who call you a burden today might need your strength tomorrow. Trust your instincts, pursue your dreams, and never let anyone convince you that wanting better for yourself makes you selfish. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming exactly who you were meant to be, and letting justice take care of the rest. The truth has a way of coming to light, especially when you're the one holding the flashlight.